Hey, welcome to Pauper Rogue. My name is Andrew, and in this video, we're going to be playing 4-color Landfall. Let's jump right into the deck tech. For our threats, we have 4 copies each of Step Links, Akoum Hellhound, Plated Geopede, and McKindy Slide Runner, each of which get increases to power and toughness whenever land enters the battlefield under our control. We also run 4 copies of Adventuring Gear, which effectively doubles the bonuses our creatures get from landfall triggers. In our lands, we run 4 copies each of Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. These lands effectively give all of our board +4/+4. We also run 4 copies of Crop Rotation and 3 copies of Ghostly Flicker. Functionally, they serve very similar purposes, but Crop Rotation is much more flexible than Ghostly Flicker is. With Crop Rotation, we are able to pay 1 mana and sacrifice a land to tutor for one of our fetch lands to create 2 additional land drops. Functionally, Ghostly Flicker is very similar to Crop Rotation. If we flicker 2 basic lands, Ghostly Flicker effectively only ends up costing 1 mana and is also able to create 2 landfall triggers. We also run 3 copies of Teamer Battle Rage, which gives target creature double strike and trample, which can sneak in some sneaky explosive wins. Other landfall decks I've seen have run cards like Groundswell, which in my opinion is not even close to the power level of Crop Rotation and Ghostly Flicker. The reason for that being is that Groundswell is single targeted +4/+4, whereas Crop Rotation and Ghostly Flicker can potentially be a +4/+4 for our entire board. For our interaction, we run 3 copies of Apostle's Blessings, which can give target creature we control protection of a color of our choice or from artifacts until the end of our turn. We can also use Crop Rotation as an instant speed protection spell by tutoring Sajiri Step to give target creature protection of a color of our choice until the end of turn. We also run 1 copy of Fiery Cannonade in the main board. All of our creatures that receive +2/+2 from landfall triggers easily survive a Fiery Cannonade, and if we've made 2 or more land drops in a turn, McKindy Slide Runner will also survive a Fiery Cannonade. To ensure we're able to make our land drops every turn, we run a small bounce package. We have 2 copies of Boros Garrison, where if it is our last land, we are able to bounce itself to its own trigger to make sure we have a land to play every single turn. Additionally, we have 2 copies of Core Skyfisher, which we are able to use to return a land to ensure we can make another land drop, and Core Skyfisher having flying is especially useful when equipped with an Adventuring Gear. In our lands, we run 3 copies of Crumbling Vestige, which is a colorless land that enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, we can choose 1 color of our choice, and we gain 1 mana of that color. Crumbling Vestige really smooths out our turn 1s, and can ensure a lot of the time that we're able to play our Akoum Hellhound and Step Links. Despite being a 4-color deck, we have a lot of colorless pips to pay for. We have our Adventuring Gear, which is 1 colorless to play and 1 colorless to equip, and we also have our Apostle's Blessing, which is 1 colorless to play. So the fact that Crumbling Vestige only gives us a colored mana on the turn it enters, and then subsequently only gives us colorless after that, is not a huge deal. On the surface, this deck can look really simple, but once you get into playing it, it has a lot of really fun play patterns that I think you'll get to see inside this video. 2 notes before hopping into the gameplay. The current iteration of this deck has 2 copies of Cast Into the Fire on the sideboard. Previously, during the recording of these games, those 2 copies of Cast Into the Fire were 2 copies of Leave No Trace. At the time of recording, it was at the tail end of the release of Commander Masters, and I was running into a lot of Bogles and Heroic. Since then, I've been seeing less of those decks, so I've converted the Leave No Trace into Cast Into the Fire. So if at any point during the gameplay you wonder why Cast Into the Fire wasn't sideboarded in when it could have been, that is the reason why. Also, all of the games showcased in this video were recorded 1 week before the online release of The Lost Caverns of Ixalan, so no cards from that set will be shown in this video. With all that being said, let's get into the games. In game 1, we keep an opening hand with multiple threats and pump. We lead with an Adventuring Gear, and our opponents show us that they are on gates. On our second turn, we draw a Hellhound, play the Hellhound and equip it. Our opponent plays another land and gets out a Sacred Cat. Back to us, we play a fetch land, threatening dealing 8 to our opponent. But they chump block with the cat. We follow that up with a McKindy Slide Runner over the Plated Geopede, because Kagates tends to have a lot of disposable chump blockers. They get down their Basilisk Gate, which can be a pretty big problem for us if they can use it to pump up a Sacred Cat to gain a lot of life with it. And on their end step, we get a blue source for our Ghostly Flicker. On our next turn, we start off with a great top deck that will allow us to set up and get out our step links and our plated Geopede to position ourselves for a kill on our next turn. On our opponent's turn, they dig, probably looking for prismatic strands that they seem not to find, and after that they also play a Modern Age that also shows no strands. On turn 5, no matter what we draw, we have lethal. We play the Crumbling Vestige, then move to combat, swinging in with everything. Our opponent chooses no blocks, and we show them the Ghostly Flicker, taking game 1. During sideboarding, we take out 1 Crumbling Vestige and 3 TBRs for 1 Bajuka Bog for Strands and Cats, and 3 Cannonades for all their X1s. In game 2, our opponent is on the play, and we keep a very low to the ground hand. We just need to draw into a way to cast our Crop Rotation, which fortunately we do off of our first draw, and we play our first Hellhound. On our opponent's turn, they loot a Strands into their graveyard and pass back to us. On our go, we get out another dog, and when I attack, I choose not to crack the fetch land because I want to save it for when we have more creatures to attack with, so I can get as much value out of it as I can. On our opponent's third turn, they play a Hawk, tutoring the rest of them to their hand. Back to us, we swing in for 4 and play our third Hellhound. After that, our opponent digs, plays another Hawk, and gets in for 1. And then we follow that up with our second fetch land. and we use this turn to force our opponent to use their strands from their graveyard. On our opponent's next turn, they cast a Brainstorm, swing in for 2, and leave up 3 Hawks for blockers. When it comes back to us, I play a land and swing in expecting to get our attack completely chumped. But the opponent only blocks 1 Hound, and that allows us to crop rotation for lethal, taking match 1. In game 1, match 2, I keep a pretty risky hand that has pretty much everything we need except multiple threats. Across from us, we see that our opponent is on Tron. Unfortunately, on our next turn, we draw another land. And then after that, we get in for 2. On their turn, our opponent shows us that they have natural Tron. After that, we draw a Ghostly Flicker, and if we're ever able to find a second threat, we'll be able to produce a lot of damage with that. On our end step, they fetch their tower. And with Tron assembled, the opponent dumps their hand and shows us that they are on Alter Tron. On our 4th turn, we draw a fetch land, which only allows us to be able to produce 10 damage. So we just get in for 4 and pass it back. Our opponent gains 6 life and digs with 2 candy trails. At this point, it seems like the game has slipped away from us. If our opponent hadn't gained 6 life last turn, we would have exact lethal. So as of now, it seems like we're out of this one. Our opponent gains some more life, and digs incredibly deep searching for their second Mirror Retriever. On this turn, we finally draw another threat, and if we can get to our next turn, we might be able to still get this. After that, our opponent continues to rip through their deck, and with half of their deck seen at this point, it seems like they still have failed to find their second Mirror Retriever. This turn, I play a land and swing in expecting to get the kill. But I forgot that the opponent can create a Golem token to chump with. So in response, I use Ghostly Flicker to get in for a little bit more damage, but more importantly, I return Garrison to my hand with its own trigger, so I can continue to hit my land drops every turn. And after combat, I get out the Slide Runner. Next up, it's all bad news when the opponent uses Wizard's Rockets to float a bunch of colored mana. And then after that, they show us the second Mirror Retriever that will win them the game. Sideboarding after game 1, I take out 1 Crumbling Vestige for 1 Bojuka Bog. Also notably, Tron typically sides in Fangren Marauder for aggro and burn matchups, so if you are anticipating this, bringing in Destroy Evil is also an option. To open up game 2, we keep a really clean opening hand with multiple threats that will curve out really nicely. And on our opponent's first turn, they lead with a Candy Tro. On our next turn, we get out our Adventuring Gear and bounce Vestige to our hand with our Boros Garrison. And then after that, we get in for 2 damage. After that, our opponent shows us that they will have Tron on the next turn, and they play another Candy Tro. This turn, we set up for a kill next turn by getting out another threat and equipping our Step Links. After that, our opponent assembles Tron and plays a Refractor, giving us an easy kill. To get the kill, we play and equip our Adventuring Gear and follow that up with a Fetch Land, creating 17 damage on board, taking game 2. We make no changes during sideboarding and are forced to keep a pretty risky 6 with only 1 creature, but with a combination of Adventuring Gear and TBR, this hand has some explosive potential. Again, our opponent has no trouble finding Tron, but we also have some good luck and found 2 additional threats. At the end of our turn, our opponent searches for their last Tron piece. After that, they play their tower, then a Golem Foundry, and do some digging. On our turn, with limited resources, I play both Adventuring Gears and opt out of playing our land this turn, so when we do play it, we can get as much value out of it as we can. Our opponent puts a lot of pressure on us when they get out the turn 4 Fangren Marauder. Unfortunately, we'll have to deal with that as fast as possible, otherwise this game will get away from us pretty quickly. Luckily, we got the perfect draw that we can use to bait our opponent into losing their Marauder. After getting the Fangren Marauder off the board, our opponent plays an Ashnod's Altar and passes back to us. We then equip both of our dogs and exile their Marauder with Bojuka Bog so they can't Blood Fountain it back later. We swing in for 8 and the opponent blocks 4 of it with a Golem token, and they sack the Golem token to a Deadly Dispute. More bad news comes when the opponent plays their second Fangren Marauder. And we follow that up by playing an Adventuring Gear and passing back to them. On turn 7, our opponent plays a land and passes back to us. And then we draw a McKindy Slide Runner and then move some equipment around. During our opponent's turn, they spin their wheels and gain 15 life. On our turn, we fail to find a land again and play a second Slide Runner. and at the end of our turn, our opponent creates a Golem token. The opponent takes no actions again, and it seems like they're choked on colors, most likely red. And when it comes back to us, we finally draw land, which will allow us to start applying some pressure. First, we move in adventuring gear and play our land, then move to attacks. With this attack, thankfully, we put our opponent into a position where in the future they're gonna have to block with their Marauder if they want to live. Seemingly still stuck on mana, our opponent again performs no actions and passes back to us. Off the top of our library, we find the land we need to force them to lose their Marauder. And after losing their Marauder, the opponent looks at the top card of their library, finding nothing, and concedes the game. After 10 matches played in the tournament practice tab, I ended even, going 5-5, which I feel is pretty typical for this deck. It tends to be favored against decks that dirtle during turns 1 and 2, or decks that heavily rely on their graveyard, because we have a pretty good post board against them. The bad matchups tend to be decks with a high density of removal, like Black-Green Gardens or Jeskai Wildfire. One last thing before I go, if you made it this far, I appreciate it so much. I had to teach myself so much in regards to recording and editing to make this video. I had a lot of fun doing this and plan to continue creating videos. I have a few decks ready, so keep your eyes open over the next few weeks. And with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. This has been Pauper Rogue. See you next time.